Hey everyone, welcome back to the debrief. This week we're taking a look at Pope Francis himself and his priorities. First of all, the Holy Father's message for the World Day of Prayer for Care for Creation, then his recent interview with Telemundo, and then we'll wrap with what else does Pope Francis see himself needing to do. In just a second, Mike Lewis will join us on the debrief. Hey friends, welcome to the debrief. It's the weekly show where we're talking about news, questions, and controversies facing the Catholic Church. I'm Dominic de Souza, the founder of Smart Catholics.
And I'm Mike Lewis, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of wherepeteris.com.
So, busy week for the Holy Father, Mike. He's got a theme for the season of creation, and it's Let Justice and Peace Flow. And we have a message for the World Day of Prayer for the Care of Creation, which takes place on September 1st. Let's just start with, what is the season of creation?
Yeah, so the season of creation started several years ago during this papacy following Laudato Si. It begins on September 1st and it carries on through the Feast of St. Francis, which is October 4th. He's had this is one of those events where Pope Francis, people are invited to the Vatican. Pope Francis gives a special message. It's a time for the church to focus on care for creation. And so in the past, I used to work for Catholic Climate Covenant, and we, it was a big deal for us. It's a big deal for the global church in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe. There's a lot of focus on it. But anyway, so this year, the theme is Let Justice and Peace Flow. Now, Pope Francis said that he draws that title from the words of the prophet Amos: let justice flow on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Basically, he said that he was given the inspiration for this theme last year during his trip to Canada. He was in Alberta, and I don't know there were a lot of pictures of him sitting in his wheelchair on the edge of Lake St. Anne in Alberta. And you could see he was deep in prayer and reflecting on the beauty of nature. In his statement, he says that lake has been a place of pilgrimage for many generations of indigenous people. Now, the basic theme of this year is water. Those of us in the developed world take drinking water for granted. Now I know that in Ohio, for example, there was a chemical spill, and people, in that part of the world, I believe Steubenville and northeast Ohio are, the water isn't drinkable. Well,
oh wow,
that's the case for millions and millions of people in different parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. They don't have, usable drinking water. Their rivers are polluted. Places are exploited. Natural resources a factory might dump into rivers. And so I just wanted to pull one quote and highlight for those who are watching this. What he said is, what Pope Francis said was, consumerist greed fueled by selfish hearts is disrupting the planet's water cycle. The unrestrained burning of fossil fuels and the destruction of forests are pushing temperatures higher and leading to massive droughts. Alarming water shortages increasingly affect both small rural communities and large metropolises. Moreover, predatory industries are depleting and polluting our freshwater sources. This is a life issue. There are people all over the world. I think I read in Ethiopia, something like 60% of people don't have access to clean, drinkable water on a regular basis. So, the water that people bathe in, modern plumbing most of the world doesn't have that. And so, but it's incredible the way that we will exploit other countries to, the developed world, sort of this ideological or industrial colonization, to take their natural resources and leave people with nothing. Also, as part of the climate crisis, the more we burn fossil fuels, the more carbon gets emitted into the air, the higher temperatures rise, and people in the, near the equator are forced to migrate to areas where they, where they can farm, where they can earn a living, and this leads to conflict. I know that there's been some cattle migration in Nigeria, for example, and that's led to a lot of basically the Muslim cattle ranchers are in the north, and then in the south you have the Christian farmers. And so because of the water shortages, the cattle ranchers are coming down south and entering the territory where they, previously had stayed out of, and that's factored into a lot of this violence. On top of religious violence, it's these property rights, it's people bringing cattle into farmland. It's, this is a big issue, and I don't think that we understand the extent to which harm to the environment is causing people.
So it seems like we don't hear much about Laudato Si or care for the earth in the U.S. church. You mentioned like the first world, we don't have to deal with a lot of the trials that so many other people do. Why do you think that is? Why are we not championing this discussion and leading and helping to make that impact or that difference?
Well, I think part of it is obviously what we've already discussed, is that we aren't facing these challenges as as readily or as much as people in the global south and people near the equator are experiencing them. I think the United States is unique in a way because in other countries, they acknowledge the reality of climate change and, they might debate over how to address it. In the United States, in our political realm, we have people who deny the existence of it or who deny that it even occurs. So there's that extra added layer of, it's not just how do we address it, it's does it exist and how do we address it? And I mean, there have been studies and things that have gone on about how, the U.S. bishops in their public statements and in their, diocesan columns, less than 1% have even mentioned Laudato Si or have mentioned the environment. I think a lot of the things in Laudato Si have been mocked. Pope Francis, for example, said, try to avoid using air conditioning, and people mocked that. Obviously, depending on the part of the world you live in, yes, air conditioning is necessary. But if you've ever been to like Las Vegas or Disney World, you have these, open air stores, 98-degree Fahrenheit heat, and there's the storefront is wide open and air conditioning is just being pumped through. This is a waste of air conditioning. Obviously, if you live in a region of the world or if your summers are super hot, yes, by all means use it. But I think, that's been exploited in a bad way. I also think that when people talk about in the United States, when we bring up climate change as being an issue, a lot of Catholics poo-poo it, or they say that's not a real issue. That's not a big issue. I mean, there are these culture war issues or these non-negotiables that people want to focus on, and they want to belittle issues that are matters of life and death for people in other parts of the world. And I think that's one of the unfortunate aspects of the lack of reception of Pope Francis's message in the United States Church. People fail to note these big global challenges, or to take a step back and look at these serious human rights issues from a global perspective, and they only talk about it from their own experience.
That's it. So that's always going to be the challenge of like the ballot perspective instead of the beatitude perspective. Moving on, like he talked to the Telemundo network, and he had an interview with them, which I haven't yet seen. You said was really good. So we're going to put the link in the show notes. And you said the interview covered a range of topics. What do they cover?
Yeah, so basically, this is the latest interview that dropped. It dropped yesterday, Thursday, or it dropped this morning. The interview was conducted on Thursday. And so he talked about everything from his health, which he says he's doing much better. He's walking again. His knee is much better, but he's had some pain. He talked about the war in Ukraine and peace. He talked about migration. Spent a lot of time actually talking about migration. Talked about it in at the U.S.-Mexico border and in Italy. Talked about women in the church. He talked about priestly celibacy. They asked him if celibacy was related to abuse, if they were able, if one of the causes was because people were celibate. And he pushed back against that, saying that most abuse occurs in families, and a lot of times it's married people, it's uncles, it's fathers, it's grandfathers. So he pushed back against that idea. There is one issue that jumped out where I've already seen a bit of criticism, and so I wanted to nip that one in the bud. It's an issue that's come up several times. And that is on the issue. They asked him about abortion, and they said, well, what about in tough cases? What about the church's teaching? Would you be willing to bend it on this or this or this? And so let me show you the answer, and we'll talk his answer, and we'll talk about the controversy. Let me see. Did that pop up? There it is.
So
okay.
His quote on abortion.
I say this about... did it just appear again? Sorry. My computer's being a little slow, so the graphics have a little lag. I say this about abortion. In any second-year university embryology book, it says that a month after conception, even before the mother is aware she is pregnant, the entire organ system is already drawn inside, and the DNA is clear. Then he continues. In other words, it is a living being. I'm not saying a person, it's a living being. So I ask myself a question. Is it lawful to eliminate a living being to solve a problem? Second question, is it lawful to hire a hitman to solve a problem? And there you have it. You're not getting me out of there because it is the truth.
I love his little turn phrase. You're not getting me out of there.
Yeah.
So what's with the why did he drop that little reference to person versus living being? I think that's where a lot of the controversy is stemming, right?
And this is, Francis has been very strong on engaging this issue in a secular context. He said countless times, this is not a religious issue. This is a human issue. This is an issue of human rights. Now, there are a lot of secular ethicists, even some religious ethicists, that put forward a view that we don't know when personhood begins. There's, one a professor from Princeton, Peter Singer, he has this notion that, a human being doesn't attain personhood until they're about 2 years old. Others like to draw the line at birth, even though they think, well, they're not really a person until a little bit after that. But it's, I guess it's based on this idea of when do they gain consciousness. Really, it's this attempt to build a slippery slope argument to justify abortion. Now, the Catholic Church isn't terribly interested in this question of when personhood begins. People obviously talk about Thomas Aquinas's ideas of quickening or ensoulment, and those are based on obsolete science. Now, John Paul II was very clear that we are to treat from the moment of conception the embryo or the zygote as a human person. But there's a theological question, and this is something that Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul, had to get a little bit creative with the language on, because when you look at the issue of twins, you start with one zygote, with one embryo, and then after a certain amount of time, it splits into two. Well, if you've only got one, is that one person or two persons, and then at the moment of the split, is each one of them half a person? There's this theological question that we haven't quite settled yet. So we can't say with that absolute definitive it's a person from that moment of conception. But basically what John Paul and Francis have been saying is it might as well be a person. It's a human life. It's the beginning of a human life. It's the beginning of personhood, whether it's triplets or quadruplets or just one baby. But I just I want to nip this in the bud, because basically what Pope Francis is saying is you can have your personhood debates, whatever. I'm not even getting into that. It is a living being. It is a human life. And so that's what he's emphasizing. And it's because he's not trying to reaffirm us in our beliefs about abortion. We're Catholics. We believe what the church teaches about human life and the sanctity of human life and human dignity. He's trying to dialogue with the secular world, with, the scientific community about, look, this is a human life. The DNA is intact. We're already looking at a developing human being. Within, a few weeks, we have fingers, toes, eyes, and everything else. So that's, I wrote about this because he gave a similar answer when America Magazine did an interview with him last year. Gloria Purvis asked a question about human life, and he brought it up then as well. So we're going to add that article to the show notes just to explain it probably a little bit more articulately than I did just now. But, I've already seen chatter on Twitter about how he's denying the personhood of the of the unborn, and he's promoting abortion, and that's not it at all. He made it clear, look, you're not bending. I'm not bending on this issue. This is, this is human life, and we can't take it. And he, of course, used the hitman analogy again. Yeah.
I was impressed to hear how clear and insistent he was on this in the Hulu documentary, the Disney's one called Amen. The kids were in the room, and he's talking to them, and he brought up this same point. And I thought, wow, that's, very, very direct, on this issue.
And, it's funny because I've looked at Pope Francis's, now it was totally unscientific, but I did a search for the words unborn, abortion, and I'm trying to think of the other terms, but basically I tried to see like how often has Pope Francis said this, and I did it about 7 years into his papacy, and I compared to the number of instances that Benedict said it, and Francis, I think, mentioned abortion and the significantly more than Benedict had. And it's interesting because it's like, they each have their own area of emphasis, but the media coverage is it's interesting how Benedict could throw in a line like threats against the family into the into his speech, and the headline would be Pope blasts gays, and whereas Pope Francis could throw a whole thing about artificial contraception and Humanae Vitae into his speech, and Pope reaches out to migrants. It's kind of it's a lot of it is in the portrayal.
What do you think that is? They're burned out, or they like a certain image of him, or
I think it depends journalist to journalist. Obviously they have some of them are maybe more progressive, but they like the Pope, so they want to present what in their eyes a positive perception of him. I do know that, for example, the Abu Dhabi Joint Declaration, it was very strong about marriage. It was very strong about abortion, and the pundits or the critics decided to focus on the line about religious diversity. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the aim that people are going for. And they'll ignore tons and tons of, I hear, so for example, I had a freelance job, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where, I was building up social media posts for that were taken from Pope Francis's quotes. And they said, go through his Wednesday audiences and pull quotes, but they said that our audience isn't uber religious. So, stay away from things like, repentance and, the rosary and devotion to Mary, but just sort of like, wisdomy things so this is, we've got to tailor it to our audience. And I had the hardest time with some of these audiences dodging words about repentance and sin and conversion and salvation. And, it's kind of amazing. And then I'll see trolls that say he never talks about God. He never talks about sin. He never talks about repentance. Mm-hmm. And it's just a very selective reading. And I think with every pope, it's been that way. If you talk to a hardcore traditionalist and hear them talk about John Paul II and Benedict, especially on issues of, ecumenism, interreligious affairs, existing in modern society, talking about science, you're going to get a very different impression of them than you would from, the American culture war standpoint or from the, hardcore progressive standpoint. I think it depends on what your priorities are, and it depends on what you think of the guy. And I think it has to do with what you prop up. Mm-hmm. Because I think when it comes to Pope Francis, there's really, and it's funny because people who haven't been following what's going on in the US, but I'll talk to Catholics from France or from Italy or from Latin America, and they're like, what are you talking about him being a heretic or being a liberal? He's a Catholic. Like, these are the things that we talk about in the Catholic Church here. And whereas I think in the US, we just have a very, very individualized experience.
So our last talking point then, you were struck by something the Holy Father said. There was a question put to him. So what does he have left to do? Or there you go.
Here,
for those who are watching. So take that away. What do you think is going to happen there?
And what do you feel you still have to do? And the Pope answered, everything. It's funny. The more you do, the more you realize that this is a copy and paste. You still have so much left to do. It's like insatiable, this thing. Granted, this is a translation. It kind of struck me as funny because obviously he is 86 years old. He started having health problems. A lot of his major accomplishments, the Synod on Synodality will end next year. There's a Jubilee year in the year 2025. He's reorganized the governance of the Diocese of Rome, the Vatican City State, overhauled the Curia. But I also look back at early in this papacy because I've been following him from day one. And it's amazing that the things that people are talking about or the things that are resonating with people were resonating with people back then. There's been a big evolution. He was planting seeds, I think. Evangelii Gaudium, his first exhortation, gave a blueprint for the type of papacy that he wanted. But it wasn't until around 2016, 2017 that he really started talking about synodality. And then it was 2018 when he put forward when the International Theological Commission put forward a document on synodality, which really developed his thought. And obviously now we're in a synod on synodality. 2018 was also the year of that trip to Chile, which was probably his least successful, at least in the short term, trip that he's taken during his papacy. And then the McCarrick crisis and Vigano's intervention took place. So 2018 was a turning point year when it came to addressing the abuse crisis. He's revamped the commission, the Pontifical Commission on the Protection of Minors. They're doing a lot more work in developing infrastructure for safeguarding in the third world. He's put forward he split the CDF into two sections, or the DDF now into two sections, where one of them is disciplinary, where they deal with priests who have committed sexual abuse against minors or any kind of sexual abuse. So yeah, I think it's interesting that a lot of these things have evolved late in the papacy. A lot of them have definitely come in the second half. But yeah, I don't know if this has been your impression, but it's like these things just sort of pop up as priorities, and he's got all these gears going as this papacy continues.
I definitely, just from a casual observing, mostly from y'all's reporting, he came out swinging, landed a couple of key big projects, and then kind of went underground for, I don't know, maybe a year or two where things weren't too massive. And then now these big seismic upheavals in just restructuring things for the future for the next pontiff. But certainly to get things a little more, moving faster, more responsive to how critical things are.
And that's something that Austin Ivory is always trying to emphasize, is that Pope Francis is focused on starting processes, not on, solving every problem, because we can't solve problems that are as wide as people feeling disenfranchised by the church, or the abuse crisis, or anything that involves human sin, something like clericalism. How can we change the attitudes of generations of bishops and priests, or you look at the culture of the Roman Curia, which has always been sort of this nepotistic, not proactive, not terribly careful organization. And it's the matter of changing a culture. But what he seems to be doing, especially with synodality, is sort of getting the gears in motion. And it's funny because I think a lot of people talk about the synod on synodality as if it's going to be Vatican III, or it's going to change church teaching or something like that. And no, this is a synod about synodality. It's the idea, I think, is just to get us used to this concept of participating as the people of God in the work of the church, to understand as Lumen Gentium put forth, that we're actually stakeholders. We actually, by our baptism, we are priest, prophet, and king. And in our own way, we have authority and we have a voice in the church. And that's been ignored for a long time. I was
going to say, this feels like, from my limited kind of viewpoint, this whole thing on synodality seems like the first time the structure has stepped in to start living out and honoring the calls that were made in Vatican II. Like, we've maybe been trying, and they've kind of been trying, and now we're trying together.
Yeah. And one of the things I think, and it's really remarkable, that we're acknowledging, and this is not to say anything about, not to contradict doctrine or anything like that, but to actually acknowledge that there are people that are hurt or leave the church due to decisions of the church, due to teachings of the church, due to administrative changes in the church. I mean, people's churches get shut down, in the United States, in these dioceses. And I remember, because I was living in Philadelphia at the time, and they were merging some churches, and there were some parishioners, some older parishioners, it was blue collar part of Philly. And this Philly guy is, standing out in front of the church. And he's like, well, and I don't remember the name of the parish, but he's like, I'm not going to St. Agnes. Those people over there, they're too uppity. I'm not going there. This is my church, and it's like, and we all bring our own gifts to the table. I don't think that this gentleman knows much about, Laudato Si, or, could tell you what a synod was necessarily. I mean, maybe he does, but what he knows is he likes going to St. Mark's, and that's his parish. And he likes he likes the priest, and he wants to raise up his kids Catholic, and that's it, and that's fine. We're at all levels. Not everyone is as big a nerd about Catholic stuff as I am. And it,
we are.
Yes, we are. And I mean, it's part of it is our upbringing, and part of it is just sort of where our interests lie. And one of the important lessons, it's a lesson in maturity, I think, when you think about these things is not everyone thinks the way you do. And I'm not talking in terms of agree and disagree. I'm saying they don't think the way you do. Like if you're a liturgy nerd and you insist and all you do is think about the liturgy and this prayer in the liturgy and that prayer in the liturgy and why did they translate this that way and why don't they do this or why did they change that? Like, okay, those are your interests, but it's a big church. And I'm going to tell you that 99.5% of Catholics don't think about those things.
Right. Well, that's, I think, a good segue to our talking point for next week. It just landed. Can you hint at what we plan to talk about next week?
So just, when we have a slot in the show notes about what to talk about next week, and I noticed that the Vatican Press Office is going to be having a press conference on Monday about a new document on engagement with social media. So I think we'll definitely have an eye on that. Also, I just want to wish everyone a happy Memorial Day weekend if you're in the United States. And it's Pentecost this weekend. So, happy Pentecost, the end of the Easter season. So I don't know if you have plans, Dominic, but
hamburgers.
Okay, good.
Hot dogs.
Good.
That's keep it simple. Mike, thanks for the debrief. Again, it's always just good to, I'll take 30 minutes and just pick your brain about what's going on with the church. Friends, we have links to articles or links to these topics in the description. And this conversation is brought to you from smartcatholics.com, the free online community for millennials, creators, and learners. Join the private Where Peter Is group that we've put together, where you can ask questions, share insights, and suggest topics for next time. We work hard to keep it free of the trolls. So it's actually a nice place to visit and chat about all of these things.
Yes, and visit wherepeteris.com to read articles, commentaries, and spiritual reflections by and for faithful Catholics who support the mission and vision of Pope Francis. And I just wanted to mention there's an article that went up yesterday as we're preparing for Pentecost by Deacon Tracy Jameson about, it's a Carmelite theological reflection on Pentecost that's gotten a lot of good feedback. So I encourage everyone to think about that and to read that one.
Take 5 on a Saturday and enjoy it. Alrighty, please hit the like button, subscribe to the Where Peter Is channel so that you never miss an episode of the debrief.
And support Where Peter Is on Patreon to help us continue to bring content like this to you.
Thank you for joining us, friends. When it comes to news and controversies in the Catholic Church, stay curious, informed, and engaged. God bless you.
God bless.